are uh, joining together for Torah study for Lunch and Learn. We've been taking a look together at the book of Psalms, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you who have joined me here on Zoom and all of you who have joined on Facebook and YouTube. Hope that you're doing very, very well. Well, this last week, a week ago Sunday, we had Simchat Torah. And Simchat Torah, of course, is the festival when we roll back the Torah back to the beginning, from the end of Deuteronomy all the way back to Genesis. And we start reading the annual cycle of Torah all over again. So last week we read Breshit, the story of the origins of the universe, the origins of humanity, the beginning of human history. And this week we'll be reading the story of Noah and the Ark and the Tower of Babel and the beginning of the next chapter of human history. So this week what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about myths of origin and what myths of origin do and what the Bible exactly did with myths of origin. Now, when we read a myth of origin, how something got started, particularly the world, how it got started, we're tempted to read this as the answer to the question, how did things get to be the way that they are? And that's sort of a natural way to read it, because that's what the story is about. It tells us how things got to be the way that they are. At the beginning of the story, things are one way, and at the end of the story, things are the way they are now. And the myth, the story of the origin story or the origin myth, tends to bridge those two realities. But in fact, I want to make the case that a myth of origin isn't just simply about how things got to be the way they are. Its real purpose is to answer the question, what is the way things are? Its real purpose is to give us a portrait of the reality that we share. And rather than simply the surface reality, the really deeper reality, the things that might not catch our attention as we look into the world as we experience it. And that's what a myth of origin does. And it becomes very important that when you change a myth of origin, you're changing people's orientation to the reality that they're sharing. Well, let's take a simple example to make this clear. When we were all kids, we learned the myth of origin of the United States of America. And the story that we learned, at least I learned as a kid, I'm sure you learned as well, is the story that there were these people living here. They were all European immigrants from various countries in Europe. They had established here colonies of the British Empire. They were living in a form of democracy that was much more liberal than the forms of democracy that existed back in Europe. And they were chafing under the tyranny of King George. And that the sparking event, of course, was the imposition of a tea tax, which King George put on the colonies in order to ask the colonies to help pay for their own self-defense. And the quote-unquote patriots objected to this because they said there should be no taxation without representation. And they had a whole series of complaints against King George's government that King George didn't seem interested in redressing. And so the colonists went and threw the tea into Boston Harbor, initiated the American Revolution, and in the ashes of that revolution, they established the United States of America. Well, the purpose of that story of origin isn't just to tell us how we got independent from England or from Britain. The purpose of that myth is to give us a glimpse of who and what we are, that we are, after all, a people seeking freedom, a people who cherish liberty, a people who threw off the bonds of tyranny. And that really defines who and what we are as a people. Well, when I was in high school, we took that same story, and the teacher, because I was in an advanced class, smart Jewish kid, right? The teacher gave us the revisionist history. Starting in the 20th century, we had a group of historians who re-examined the myth of origin of the United States and gave us a new way of reading the story of American independence. And they said, well, it wasn't quite that way. The real story was that the colonists had come to a certain degree of economic prosperity and were loath to share that prosperity with England. And the real question wasn't a group of liberty-loving patriots who were fighting for their own land and their own people for representation beyond taxation. What it really was a group of wealthy merchants who didn't want the British government messing with their mercantile success. and that this was a upper middle class revolution with serious economic roots. Well, that's been debated, of course. There are other other stories that have been added as well. But think for a moment about the difference between the story we learned as kids, the patriots seeking liberty, and the revisionist story, which says merchants seeking their own prosperity. It's a very different picture of America. And whatever, whichever is true factually in terms of the origins of the American Republic, what's more important is that the two stories show us very different pictures, not of how we got here, but of who we are. And the purpose of the story is to answer the question, who are we? And if you say that we were a people that were founded by this merchant class trying to throw off the imposition, excuse me, of British taxation and regulation, you have a very different sense of who and what we are. Well, the same thing occurs in the biblical text. We have an origin story of the universe. And I'm going to suggest to you something kind of radical, which is that this text wasn't handed down by God to Moses, or maybe it was, but it came with a cultural context. It was actually a response. It was a polemic against an existing cultural trend, a cultural theme about how the world got to be the way it was. So let's take a look for a moment. I have a text up here on the board. I'm going to put it up, and we all know the beginning of Genesis. So here's, sorry for this. I'll get up to the top here. Sorry. Go all the way to the top. Here it is. It's in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, or the other translation, this is the JPS translation, when God began creating heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And on the second day, he separates dry land from water. And on the next day, he creates vegetation that grows from the dry land. And on the next day, he creates sun, moon, and stars, and so forth. Now, what's particularly interesting about this story is how quiet and peaceful it is. Makes it very uncinematic. Not a very good movie, because there's no war, there's no conflict, there's no struggle. And that was done on purpose. You see, there was, in fact, a great Mesopotamian story, a great story that gripped the entire Near East. And it was a story of a battle among the gods, battles between the gods and the forces of nature, struggles and fights among the forces of nature. And those Mesopotamian myths, they had their origins in Acadia, in southern Mesopotamia, spread north through Mesopotamia and into Canaan, where we lived. Those Mesopotamian myths were all about war. They were about battle. They were about the forces of nature struggling for hegemony against the will of the gods, and the will of the gods struggling against the forces of nature. The Bible knew those stories, or that is, the writers of the Bible story knew those stories, knew them very well. These were their bedtime stories, after all. And they wrote for us an origin story that was a specific polemic against it, because the one thing that is missing from Genesis is struggle. There's no war. There's no battle. There's this very quiet, majestic process of reality rolling out of God. Now, there are some hints, just some hints here, right? When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu, sort of onomatopoeic, meaning mishmash, unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep. Now, wait, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. Well, if there's nothing there, where did water come from? What do you mean there's water there all of a sudden? And what's this, the deep? Well, the word for deep is tehom. And tehom is the Hebrew version of the word Tiamat. And Tiamat was the mother goddess of the Canaanite and Mesopotamian myth stories. Tiamat was the mother goddess who went to war against her children. Tiamat was this powerful goddess, jealous of the powers and the prerogatives and the privileges of her children who go to war with them. And the Bible subdues that. and makes it the deep. And water is the symbol of chaos in the ancient world. Water is the symbol of chaos. This week, we're going to read the Noah story. And the wonderful thing about the Noah story is that it recognizes that when you bring water into the world, you bring chaos. There's water below us and water above us, and we live in a sort of island in between, and God opens up the faucets of both, and that's how the flood comes. The flood comes because the moral chaos of human beings is now matched by the natural chaos of a God who says, I'm not protecting you anymore. There's light and there's darkness, and they don't fight against each other in this story. There's dry land and water. They don't fight against each other in this story. The animals come into the world and there's no struggle. And that's the theme of the story. That's what makes the story powerful and unique. So that what I'm going to suggest to you is the following, that the ancient Near Eastern mythologies pictured a world which was very forbidding. It was a world of struggle, a world where anything you built, anything you dreamed of, anything you created could be sullied by the gods and their capricious behavior. And that anything you did manage to build was pretty lucky. And in fact, the idea was not to be too conspicuous, because if you were too conspicuous, the gods would come and screw up whatever it is that you built. So it is a philosophy of passivity. It is a philosophy of resignation, trying to remain invisible so that the gods don't come and sully and spoil and ruin the things that you created. That's what the ancient Near Eastern myth was trying to teach. This story comes along and tries to teach a very different idea of being human, because it offers us a very different picture of the world. The world is not created out of conflict and struggle and war and antagonism. The world is created by a beneficent, loving creator who, in an orderly and majestic fashion, brings reality to be, and then crowns that reality with the greatest of all of his creations, the human being, the one creature who bears God's image and is put into the world to be a co-creator, a ruler of the universe along with God, a ruler of the natural world along with God. It is a universe, it is a myth which allows us to dream and to build and to hope and to act. It's an empowerment myth, as opposed to the Mesopotamian myth, which is a disempowerment myth. And this is what's so important about Genesis. This is the great contribution of Genesis to world consciousness. It's an invitation for human empowerment and human responsibility. Aha. However, and here comes the big however for this week, the myths, the ancient myths of the Mesopotamians didn't disappear so quickly. Because, when you change an origin story, the people who hear it for the first time are shocked by the thing. But the old stories, they still remain with them. The old stories still stay with us. Look, even language, just take for just a moment, just if you'll excuse this quirk of language, right? If you're making a phone call, what's the verb that you used? You say, well, here's the number you need to dial. Well, there haven't been dials on telephones for 30 years. And yet, dialing this number is still a verb that we tend to use. We talk about the sun setting and the sun rising. And we know astronomically the sun doesn't set and the sun doesn't rise. That's just the way it appears on our horizon. But we use that language because people got used to that language, because the ancient ways of doing things, of thinking about things, don't go away so very quickly. And so what we're going to find is that tucked into the Bible, in lots of interesting corners and places, and especially in our book of Psalms, are the remnants of the old mythologies. The old mythologies where God enters the world, and in this case, it's going to be our God. It's not going to be the Mesopotamian gods, and creates the world through a war, that there was a great battle between God and the forces of chaos. And the forces of chaos are going to be personified with names. And the forces of chaos have a lot to do with water, because water in the ancient East is chaos. Listen, if you ever had a roof leak and you hired a contractor to come fix it, and he said, gee, I don't know, I can't quite find where it's coming in, but it's spreading through your, I mean, water is chaos. So if you're going to find that the myths of a battle between God and the forces of chaos all have to do with water. So let's take a look at where the ancient Near Eastern myths of battle and conflict and aggression and championship ultimately came back into the tradition through a back door. The front door was Genesis, which did away with those myths. But the back door was the poetry. Because when people are doing poetry and when they're appealing to our emotions through poetry, they bring ancient idioms, ancient forms of language, ancient ways of talking, which Genesis very consciously tried to stamp out. Okay, let's take a look together, shall we? The buried traditions of mythology left in the Bible. Well, here's Psalm 74. And the Psalm 74 is an odd psalm because it's a psalm that was put together in exile, and it begins and ends asking God to judge the nations who have destroyed us. It's the psalm of vengeance, actually. But in the middle, it establishes this idea that God is powerful. How do we know God is powerful? Well, because God was the one who created all of this. So here's Psalm 74, beginning with the 12th verse. O God, my King from old, who brings deliverance throughout the land. It was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the water. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan. Now, Leviathan, was the ancient Near Eastern sea monster. Leviathan was the ancient sea monster. And we don't have this in Genesis. This was the part of the story that Genesis pushed out. It didn't want a battle. But in the myth that Genesis replaced, which remained in the consciousness, the memory of ancient Israel, how did the world begin? Well, God went to war against the water and pushed it back, and then smashed the heads of the monsters, because the monsters represent the water and its chaos, and principally Leviathan, who left him as food for the denizens of the desert. So what was the myth? That before God could push back the waters and create an ordered universe for us to live on, ordered dry land, God had to defeat the sea monsters. And in particular, the king of the sea monsters, who's Leviathan. And God defeats Leviathan and then takes his body and brings it out and feeds the world with it. There's a big feast of Leviathan. And there's actually a wonderful story, a folklore, that when the Messiah comes, that God will once again give us a feast of Leviathan. So I hope you like fish, because it's a very, very big fish. It was you who released the springs and torrents, who made rivers run dry. So this notion that God is organizing the waters of the world so that we could have a dry land to live on. The day is yours, the night also. It was you who set in place the orb of the sun, who fixed its boundaries of the earth. Summer, winter, you made them. This idea of fixing boundaries, that God organized the seasons. Now, it's interesting that in Genesis, there's nothing about seasons. All you have is day and night. But the idea that God organized the year as well and organized the seasons, that's part of this ancient myth, where God had to go to war against time itself and to turn time into an orderly progression. That's Psalm 74. I'm going to skip Psalm 104 for a second. That's going to be our principal text today. But I want to show you some more pictures of this. I want to show you some more texts in which the ancient Near Eastern myths creep their way back into the memory and into the storytelling of the creation story. But before we do, let's take a moment and see if anybody has questions or comments or counter sermons. Anybody got anything? Yes, Bert, you're up.
So God, as part of the original myth, had to defeat Leviathan.
Right.
Did not God create Leviathan?
Good question. The story doesn't begin there. The story begins with the battle. I mean, we don't have the myth. We don't have the story. We do have the ancient Near Eastern myth. So in the ancient Near Eastern myth, right, you have two gods. You have Tiamat, who's the goddess of the heavenly waters, and you have Ea, who is the goddess of the earthly waters. And they mix. The sweet waters and the salty waters, they mix, and out of them come all the gods, and the gods fill the world, and the gods fill the world with conflict and with struggle and with noise. And Tiamat is very upset with this. She wants the quiet she used to enjoy with her consort, so she goes to war against her children. That's the ancient Near Eastern myth. Okay, what the Canaanite, or what is what the Jewish version of the myth was, we don't quite know. But you end up having this impression, and you'll see this with the text we're about to learn, that that God enters a world that's already heavily populated with all these monsters, and that God has to defeat these monsters in order to create a habitable world for us. It sounds vaguely like, if you know the Greek mythology, which is that the gods go to war against the Titans. And the Titans are these monstrous creatures that existed before the gods, and it's Zeus who goes to war against the Titans and subdues the Titans and then rules from Olympus. Same idea, because the idea is that the world begins in conflict. So there's no attention paid to how all these things got there, because the God of this myth is not that kind of an omnipotent God. He has to struggle, and the struggle takes a while. It's not an easy struggle, right? And that's sort of how you'll see this in a minute. You'll see this where the texts come in. Yeah, David.
Well, it just, the story you told about the revisionist story about American history and the American Revolution seems much more, to me, congruent with what I experienced, what I observe in the world for years. Mm-hmm. And the story you're telling about this, the Leviathan and all that seems much more congruent with things I read in the source, or of course much later history, but Pillars of the Earth, or that is a much more tumultuous world, and it just fits more. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, but that's how it strikes me, and it's an certainly eye-opening.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, look, when you're living in a world in which an abscessed tooth or a broken leg could kill you, if you're living in a world in which a flu epidemic comes and wipes out half the population, when you're living in a world when a year of famine could wipe out so many, I mean, when you live in a world where you are completely subject to these forces of nature, I mean, we're here all stuck at home because of COVID, right? But the fact is that this is unusual. I mean, it's never happened. That we keep saying it's unprecedented. It never happened. When I was 6 years old, I remember getting the polio vaccine. Remember that? I mean, we were kids. I was 6 years old. We lined up at the elementary school, and the nurse gave us a little cup with a sugar cube coated in some orange goo, and Mom said, "Take it." And we said, "Why?" And she said, "Just do it." And my mother became very teary-eyed, because she said polio was a demon that pursued children, and we couldn't swim in the summer, and you couldn't play. And the president of the United States at one point had polio and was disabled, and now it's gone. I mean, so you live in a world of all these dangers. So this myth of a world in which all the forces of nature are struggling against each other, and you and I are innocent bystanders, we're collateral damage in the war of the gods against each other, fits that world. It fits that world, right? And that's exactly what the myth is trying to say. Now, the Bible comes along and says, okay, I'll be right with you, Sheila. The Bible comes along and says, yeah, it's true that there's a great struggle for being, but that doesn't mean that the world isn't good. That isn't the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is a world that you can rule and that you can manage. And that's a very different attitude toward nature than the myth that you have right here. Sheila, yes.
Yes, I just thought of something. Leviathan, a huge monster, dinosaurs.
it maybe I don't dinosaurs died out long before humans lived on this planet, and I know maybe there was some sort of genetic memory of what dinosaurs were. You know what I think it rather is? I think it's rather something that you'll be very familiar with because you were such a gifted teacher and are a gifted teacher. But I think it's partly our subconscious. I think all of us are afraid of monsters and monsters live in our subconscious from the time that we're little children. And there are these forces in the world that we're scared of. And that what we eventually do as we grown up is that we don't leave behind that fear, we simply sublimate it. We simply sublimate that fear into our unconscious, and that in our dreams, how many of us have had dreams where terrible things are pursuing us? Terrible monsters are pursuing, because that's where your subconscious is telling you, I'm afraid, right? And by the way, I mean, another way to look at this, and I don't want to get political, so please don't drag me into this, but typically when you have a political conflict, you're being presented with two different pictures of the world and pictures of who we are in the world and what's called upon us to do. And in particular, an election like this one, which is so momentous, there really is a sense that there are two very different pictures of the world being presented. Stanley.
We said that there are cultures that are at the time that these came from. We don't think often of what came before that, before there were any cultures at all, before people were just more animal than people and did fight each other even to become anything. So actually that's how we got to even the starting point.
Right. The struggle for existence and the sense in which nature is my enemy. Nature is pushing back against me. I mean, that's the brilliance or the radicalness of the radicality or radicalness, the radical nature of Genesis is that nature obeys God. God says, let there be light, and boom, there's light. And then God separates the light from the darkness, and the darkness doesn't object. It doesn't give him a hard time. And then he separates the water from the dry land, and the waters go where they're told to go. I mean, there's this sense in which this dominating God is able to organize creation, and there's no resistance, which is so very different from our own experience, in which anything you tried to create, there's resistance. Anything you try to organize, there's resistance. And, and all of us know what that's like, There's this sense in which the world pushing back against our will, pushing back against our dreams and our plans. Yes, Bert, please.
It would seem to me, Rabbi, that if we accept initially the notion of an omnipotent God, that nature not pushing back is what we would expect in that set of conditions. If God were not omnipotent, then nature could push back because he can't, or he, she, or it can't do much. But if they're omnipotent, then of course they don't push back. So I think it only, for me at least, re-emphasizes the power of God in all ways.
Well, I think you're right. I think what's happening here is the development of an idea of omnipotence. That's what Genesis represents. I think you have this exactly right. Genesis represents the birth of this idea of omnipotence, right? And if there was an omnipotent God, then there's no room for this struggle. But the myth that preceded Genesis, which I'm suggesting to you, that myth which came before Genesis and is still maintained in the collective memory of the Jewish people and surfaces in these poetic expressions, in that myth, God is really, really powerful, but not omnipotent, because here's where you get the struggle. Okay? So let's go back and take another look, because there's some more text I want to share with you, and then we'll get to the Psalm. So this is the book of Job, which is, of course, one of the most remarkable books of the Hebrew Bible. So you remember the story of Job. So in the story of Job, he's a righteous man, he's afflicted, and he's afflicted unjustly, and he complains to God for 35 chapters. He's complaining. and his friends come and try to justify God. And in the middle of this, there's a meditation about God's power in the world. Whether God is ever going to answer Job, that's the question. And Job says, I don't think he's going to come to answer because he's too powerful. And here's Job's words. The shades trembled. The shades, of course, are these ghosts beneath the waters and their denizens. Sheol. Now, Sheol is a place. It's the place you go when you die. It's not considered hell. It's not punishment. It's not reward. It's just the place you go when you die. Think of it as your dentist's waiting room, with old magazines and Muzak playing. And you sit there forever, okay? And Sheol, but here Sheol is personified. Sheol is like death. And that's why it's capitalized. Sheol is naked before him. Abaddon, I don't know what that is. I looked for it, but couldn't figure it. Has no cover. It is who stretched out Saphona over chaos. Now, Saphona means the north, but here Saphona is being used to refer to some natural goddess over chaos, who suspended earth over emptiness. He wrapped up the waters in his clouds, yet no cloud burst under the weight. He shut off the view of his throne, spreading his cloud over it. He drew a boundary on the surface of the waters and the extreme where the light and darkness meet. The pillars of heaven tremble, astounded at his blast. His power, he stilled the sea. By his skill, he struck down Rahab. By his wind and heaven was calm, and his hand pierced the elusive serpent. So who is Rahab? Now, we know Rahab. That name you should know, because she was, you should excuse the terrible expression, the whore with the heart of gold. She is the quote unquote innkeeper. The word is zonah. She's the innkeeper or the prostitute who welcomes the spies from Jericho into Jericho and welcomes Joshua's army into Jericho. But the original Rahab wasn't that woman. She was named for the other ancient Near Eastern sea monster. This one being a big snake. Rahab is the big snake. And it was through God's power that Rahab was struck down. His wind and heavens were calm. His hand pierced the elusive serpent. These are glimpses of his rule, the mere whisper that we perceive of him. Who can absorb the glory of his mighty deeds? So here in Job, you have again this notion that it was God who went to war against all of these primeval forces and monsters in order to create the world that we inhabit. And one more, this is in Isaiah 51, which is the third Isaiah. And here you have the myth resurfacing. Awake, awake, clothe yourself with splendor, O arm of God. Awake as in days of old, as in former ages. It was you who hacked Rahab into pieces, fighting the war. So there was this battle between God and the sea monsters, and God wins and hacks up Rahab that pierced the dragon. It was you that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the abyss of the sea a road that the redeemed might walk. So here we get all of these poetic renditions of the creation story that bring back the ancient Near Eastern myths that Genesis had suppressed because they were too good. And when the psalmist wants to talk poetically about God's power, he's going to recall these myths in which God went to war with all these frightening monsters and gave us a world that we can inhabit. The most direct example of this is Psalm 104. So I chose this because we just read Genesis. And the other ironic thing is that yesterday was Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, the first day of the Hebrew month of Cheshvan. And Psalm 104 is the psalm we read on Rosh Chodesh because it's a psalm about creation. So let's take a look at Psalm 104 together. Okay. It starts out and it ends with just a formulaic blessing of God. Blessed the Lord, my soul, the Lord, my God, you're very great. You're clothed in glory and majesty, wrapped in a robe of light. You spread the heavens like a tent cloth. So you imagine looking up at the clouds early in the morning, and seeing the sun hit the clouds early in the morning and imagining that that's God arising from God's throne. And we can't see God, but we can see the sunlight reflected off of God's robes. Those are the clouds of the early morning. He set the rafters of his lofts in the waters, made the clouds his chariots, moved on wings of the wind. So the idea that the sun is crossing the horizon is actually God's power entering into our world, and the chariot is the sun. This is the sun. He makes the winds his messengers, fiery flames his servants. So this is a God who is revealed to us in the majesty and in the beauty and the power of nature. He established the earth on its foundation so that it will never totter. Now remember, why did the earth have to be put on foundations? Because what's underneath us? Water. You had to drive piles into the water, right? So the idea is that the whole world is one giant pier. I want you to understand that. You made the deep cover it as a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. They fled at your blast. So here's the notion. So the water had to be pushed back in order to create land, rushed away at the sound of your thunder. Mountains rising, valleys sinking to the place you established for them. You set bounds that they must not pass, so they never again cover the earth. You made springs gush forth in torrents. They made their way between the hills, giving drink to the wild beasts, and wild ass slaked their thirst. So there was this whole water imagery of God organizing the water, because the water was chaos. And to turn the water from chaos that destroys everything to an organized stream so that life can persist was one of God's greatest achievements, one of God's works. And the fact that there is water in the world that is benevolent, streams and rivers and irrigation, means that is an indication of God's handiwork of creation. By the way, just for those of you who lives in our neighborhood, I live just a few blocks from the Sepulveda Dam, which is sort of this strange dam. But you have to realize that before the Sepulveda Dam and the Hansen Dam were built in the San Fernando Valley, the San Fernando Valley was uninhabitable because there would be floods every 10 years, and the floods would wipe out everything in this valley. And it was the Army Corps of Engineers during the Depression that built these dams, and that's what made the valley inhabitable. That's why the valley was never inhabited by more than just a few people before the Second World War. But after the Second World War, it became the fastest growing suburb in North America because the dams held back the waters that would wipe out the communities. So this is what the psalmist is seeing in the world. And he says, that tells me that God's working in the world. The birds of the sky dwell beside the rivers, and sing among the foliage. You water the mountains from your lofts. The earth is sated from the fruit of your work. You make grass grow for cattle and herbage for man's labor, that he may get food out of the earth, wine that cheers the heart of men, oil that makes the face shine, and bread that sustains life. So all of the gifts of nature are the works of God. And the very presence of a world that feeds us, the very presence of a world that is benevolent, the world that is providing, is in fact the indication of a God who's at work, creating opportunities for human beings to share the gifts of life. Now comes the mythology, comes roaring back. The trees, they drink. Now he's got all the water put together now. The trees drink their fill. The cedars of Lebanon is on planting, where birds make their nests. The stork are home in the junipers. So these were people who lived in nature. They lived in nature, and they found God in nature. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that the rabbis, when they created our tradition, consciously backed away from nature. I mean, for example, what's really interesting is on Rosh Hashanah, we celebrate Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. But the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah is not Breshit. It's not Genesis. It has to do with Abraham and the beginning of the Jewish family. The rabbis consciously broke away from this nature religion because they were afraid that we might draw the wrong consequences, the wrong conclusions, rather, from worshiping God through nature. First of all, it's too easy to worship nature and to forget about the God that created it. That's the first problem. That was the source of paganism in the ancient world. But beyond that, they didn't want nature to be the evidence of God because, number one, nature's amoral. Nature doesn't care who you are. When there are these horrible fires, the fire burns the houses of righteous people and burns the houses of sinful people in the same breath. Right? Earthquakes dry, my house fell down in an earthquake. And I remember the insurance guy coming to see me and asking me, if you believe in a God of justice, how could God have done this to you? And I say, God didn't do this to me, but God did send me State Farm insurance. So because nature is not moral, you don't want to draw your conclusions about a moral God from nature. And because in nature, time is cyclical and there's nothing new under the sun, you don't want to draw your model for history from nature. Nevertheless, in the book of Psalms, we have this beautiful worship of God through nature. This beautiful sense in which nature is not God, but nature is a window into the power and the glory of divinity, right? The high mountains are for wild goats, crags for refuge for rock badgers. And as God organizes creation so that everyone has an environment, everyone has a habitat, everyone belongs in the place where he belongs. You made the moon to mark the seasons, sun to know when to set. You bring on darkness and its light. When all the beasts of the forest stir, the lions roar for prey, seeking their food from God. So nature now becomes a window, not God itself, but a window into divinity. When the sun set, they come home and couch in their dens. Man then goes to his work, to his labor until evening. How many are the things you made, O Lord? You made them all with wisdom. The earth is full of your creation. Okay, now comes back the hint. Ready? There's the sea. There's the water again. Always comes back to water because water's chaos, vast and wide, with its creatures beyond number, living things small and great. There go the ships, and Leviathan that you formed to sport with. So Leviathan, which was one so dangerous, so scary, Leviathan, which was the symbol of the chaos striking back against creation. Leviathan, which is the waters pushing back against the boundaries that God had set. Here, Leviathan is our pet. He's a plaything. He's a pet. All of them look to you to give their food when it's due. Give it to them, gather them up, open your hand, you're well satisfied. Hide your face, they're terrified. Take away their breath, they perish at the turn into dust. And send back your breath, they are created. So it's the breath of God that animates all of these things that fill the natural world. So I just wanted to, what's wonderful is the way that the pre-Genesis myth comes back. The pre-Genesis myth comes back of a God who has to struggle against the forces of chaos in order to create the world that is habitable, and that the God who vanquishes those things, and that's why we worship this God. And the problem here, of course, was that Genesis wanted to offer us a different picture of the world. Genesis didn't want the battle. Genesis didn't want the struggle. Genesis, as Bert said, wanted an omnipotent God who has no trouble doing any of this and does it out as an act of benevolence. But the ancient myth was too great. It had too much of a hold on the imagination. And I think that, your comments before, I think the ancient myth also had too much resonance with what's in our own subconscious. Our own subconscious, as we grow from childhood into adulthood, facing all the monsters of the world, so that the ancient myth of the conflict never went away, was buried, it was sublimated, but comes popping out in these wonderful fantasies, that are presented us in biblical poetry. Now, I'll tell you one last piece of this, which is it comes out elsewhere in Jewish history. And one of the wonderful places it comes out, we don't going to get into it now, is in the Kabbalah, in mysticism. Because in the Kabbalah, you have this notion of a God, and there's a great deal of conflict in the in the it's this wonderful conflict in the world, and that conflict is built into God, and it's built into the world, because the Kabbalah is created under conditions of terrible historical persecution and difficulty. And so it was kind of natural for the rabbis, the teachers of the mystical tradition, to go back to these stories of conflict and struggle, of aggression and response, in order to sort of picture the world. And that's the picture of the world that the Kabbalah gives us. And we can come to that another time, but here you have it in the biblical poetry, which I think is so very interesting. So here's your homework assignment, right? Your homework assignment is to go into the world and tell me which of these stories you think fits the world we live in right now. Right, a world of conflict and struggle and aggression, or a world of peaceful habitation and the possibility of human empowerment. And think about why Genesis did what it did in destroying, in sublimating, in sort of subjugating and sublimating that myth of conflict. All right, one last time, any questions, comments, counter sermons? David, thank you for your comments on the chat. Thanks. Stanley, you're up.
I'm wondering about the myth of the second creation story that tells more about people than about God.
Yeah, good. The second creation story also doesn't have conflict in it. Right? I mean, man disobeys, but there's no conflict. Same thing. God creates the man, puts that. It's like, why doesn't he put him in a castle? Why doesn't he put him in a shopping center? Why a garden? And think about this for a minute. A garden is the most wonderful metaphor for a world in which everything has its place and everything fits and everything helps everything else to grow. A garden is a metaphor for oneness. A garden is a beautiful metaphor for oneness. And I heard a wonderful talk this last week in which the teacher made the comment that the Garden of Eden was not meant to be an origin story. It was meant to be a destination story. That the story of the Garden of Eden is not where we came from. It's where we're all hoping to go. It's a place of oneness where everything has a special place. Nothing is at war with anything else. It's really the opposite of the struggle, because everything is there to nurture, to fertilize, and to help everything else grow. Remember, when we're put into the garden, what are we told to eat? Fruit. Not even vegetables. See, the difference between eating an apple and eating an asparagus is when you eat an asparagus, you kill the plant. But when you eat an apple, you keep the plant alive. Nothing kills anything to eat in the Garden of Eden. Lions and tigers were all vegetarians. They ate tofu. But that's the image of the Garden of Eden. It's the exact opposite of the struggle. It's a place of peaceful sublimity, or sublime peacefulness, rather. And that's what's so wonderful about that myth. Well, thank you for coming on. We'll see each other next week.
Thank you.
Minyan every night at 6, every morning at 7:30. Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday afternoon at 5. And not this week, but next week, we're going to change the clock. So we'll have to adjust some of these times. Torah study, 10 o'clock in the morning on Shabbos. 9 o'clock in the morning on Shabbos, followed by services at 10 o'clock and Havdalah at 7. And I really hope that everybody's taking very, very good care of yourselves. Stay well, wear your mask, wash your hands, and come back to us healthy and whole so we can continue our learning. See you next week.